Genesis 1 through 3 is the beginning of everything. Not just the Bible, but the ache beneath every story that we carry. It introduces the world, the characters, the intent, and the obstacle of Scripture. It is the setup for the entire biblical narrative. Films used to begin with an overture. It was a piece of music that would play during the opening credits, establishing the mood and context. And Genesis 1 through 3 is the overture of the biblical story. And today, we're going to unpack that thought as we dive into Season 1 of Genesis. This is Cinematic Scripture, where faith and film get a seat at the same table. I'm Kyle. Let's roll film. All right, so Season 1 of Genesis is going to cover Genesis chapters 1 through 3. And it can be seen as the overture of Scripture. And I think calling Genesis 1 through 3 an overture, it does not diminish at all the first 3 chapters of the Bible. Rather, it elevates our understanding of the importance of these chapters. Craig Bartholomew and Michael Gothine, they said this. They said, the Bible is not a collection of isolated texts, but a unified drama of redemption. Now, the overture, it lays down musical themes that will resurface and resonate again and again throughout the film. In Genesis 1 through 3, it lays down themes that will unfold during the drama of redemption in the biblical text. So you're gonna see creation, vocation, trust, fracture, and hope. And we're going to see this over and over and over again. Now, I have already done episodes on Genesis 1 through 3, but I think they are worth revisiting as a collection, as their importance to understanding the rest of the Bible cannot be overstated. For now, we're going to, as we dive into Scripture, when we do scriptural videos, we're going to do just seasons and overviews of like chapter groups, kind of like if it was a season of a book or a season of a show. So we're going to try that because I think that gets us enough information out diving into the weeds of every chapter. You can let me know in the comments if you like this or not. The Bible does not begin in Genesis 3 after the fall. It begins in Genesis 1:1 with the words, "In the beginning, God." Now, I've heard people talk, I've had conversations where people they hold to this view that the Bible starts in Genesis 3 with the fall. Well, that's where the story begins. And I get it because that's where the conflict rises, is in the fall. But to hold to that view means that you miss out on so much of the context, the character, and the intent of God and his plan. So we have to have a fuller picture of Scripture and who God is and his plan and his intent. We have to include Genesis 1 and 2. So let's dive into this. All right, so we're going to start with Act 1, Creation and Vocation, Genesis 1. So God speaks and chaos transforms into order. God speaks and light breaks through the darkness. God breathes and humanity is formed in his image. They're not just created, but they're also commissioned. The world is good and the partnership between God and humanity is sacred. Then we get to Act 2, Communion and Trust in Genesis 2. God plants a garden. It's a place of presence, of rest, and relationship. Humanity is invited to trust, to cultivate, to govern, and to name. The tree in the center becomes a symbol of trust or autonomy. And then nakedness is innocence. And work is worship, and God is near. It's this place of communion and trust. And then we get to Act 3 of this season, the fracture and exile of Genesis 3. The serpent speaks, and autonomy is grasped. Shame replaces innocence. Hiding replaces communion. Blame replaces trust. And God, in the midst of this, he pursues, but exile begins. Now, there are echoes. I call them narrative echoes. There's symbols, and there's story-shaped theology all through Genesis 1 through 3. And we do not have the time today to cover the breadth and depth of all of the imagery that is planted in these first 3 chapters. They're going to carry out throughout moments of Scripture. But I do want to name a few, okay? Because again, Genesis 1 through 3, it's the overture of redemption. So it's imagery, it's symbolism, and narrative patterns. They're going to ripple through Scripture. And so we need to pay attention because it reveals a theology shaped by story. So let's dive in, okay? Biblical imagery, it's not just decorative, it's theological. There are motifs that are going to appear here that evolve across the canon of Scripture, becoming invitations to see God's character and the redemption arc. So first off, we have light, okay? God's first creative act. He separates chaos from order. And light, it reappears in Exodus. It's a pillar that guides the Israelites. In John's prologue, the light of the world. And then Revelation City, which has no sun. the New Jerusalem, there's no sun in it because God, the light, is at the center. We have a garden, which is a sacred space for communion, and that's going to evolve because it foreshadows the tabernacle. There's going to be things in the tabernacle that call back to the garden, some of the symbolism there and some of the imagery, the temple, and the New Jerusalem. The garden foreshadows the tabernacle, the temple, and the New Jerusalem. We have a tree. Here it's a symbol of trust and autonomy, or trust and temptation. And this is going to reappear as the cross, where we, just as humanity had a choice in the garden, trust or autonomy, now the choice is through the cross of Christ, through another tree. There's fig leaves here. They point to humans' effort to cover shame, but they're going to evolve and be contrasted with divine provision, because throughout Scripture, we will see in this story where people are given a chance to come to God and confess in truth, or to hide and cover themselves. And a lot of times they cover themselves. So we're going to see this. Then there's animal skins. Here it's bloodshed. There's an animal that dies, and then God uses the animal skin to cover Adam and Eve. So it's the first sacrifice, but we're going to see even more of sacrifice in the priesthood and Levitical laws, but also ultimately it points to Christ as the covering, the bloodshed for the covering. But it will be picked at in Exodus with the blood over the doorposts, with the Passover happening, and also Levitical laws. So we're going to see these. And these images that we're talking about, these narrative echoes, these are like story-shaped invitations to see these little breadcrumbs throughout to stay with the story. And then Genesis also is going to introduce symbolic moments that reveal some awesome spiritual truths, okay? So symbolically, they are naked and they are known, but then that moves to they are ashamed. And so innocence is vulnerability, okay, to start, but trust then is lost and transparency ruptures. So the symbolism of naked to known to ashamed, it starts as vulnerability, then trust is lost, and then transparency ruptures. They go from naming to blaming. This is where dominion becomes deflection and relationships fracture. So the symbolism of they were naming together, now they're blaming each other. Dominion becomes deflection, okay? They're walking with God, and then they're hiding from God. So presence, the symbolism of presence becomes fear, and communion is broken. Trust and autonomy. There's a partnership with God that ultimately becomes grasping. We want to do it our own way, and the root of sin is revealed. There's a partnership to separation. Communion with God in the garden then becomes exile. They are separated. They are pushed out of the garden. And the ache of lost vocation begins, where now it's, okay, now we're on this journey to restore what has been lost in the garden. Robert Altler, he writes this. He says, biblical narrative is shaped by repetition and rupture. What breaks the pattern reveals the theology. So with that in mind, I think you can say Genesis 3 is the rupture and the revelation. It reveals theology, but it's also the rupture of what happens. And these patterns that we're talking about, that these symbolisms, these imagery, they are going to carry, again, they reverberate through the entire biblical arc. All right. These are patterns. So we have creation to Exodus to new creation, where God creates, God liberates, and then God recreates. And we kind of see this pattern over and over again. There's vocation, there's covenant, and there's commission. Humanity is called to co-rule. Israel is called to bless, and the church is called to embody. So vocation, let's rule, covenant, bless, commission, go and embody these. There's a trust to temptation to testing, where Eden's tree becomes Sinai's law. Are you going to trust? Are you tempted to not trust? It becomes, so in the garden, here we go. Are you going to trust Sinai's law? If you do these, you'll be blessed. If you don't do these laws, you'll be cursed. Gethsemane's cup, Jesus says, God, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but your will. It's this tempting, this trusting. And then our daily surrender. Are we going to pick up our cross and follow Jesus? So these motifs, these themes, they're all throughout, okay? So Genesis 1 through 3, all that to say, Genesis 1 through 3 lays the theological and narrative foundation for everything that follows. It's not just the beginning of the Bible. It's the beginning of the ache of redemption. It's the beginning of the arc of redemption, and it's the invitation into the story. It sets up what's going to happen. There's also gospel echoes of Christ in the midst of this. So it lays the foundation. Genesis 3 specifically, I would say, lays the foundation for the imagery of Christ. And these are very two popular passages, so you've probably heard these. Genesis 3:15, when God's telling the serpent, hey, here's the consequences for your actions. It says, you're going to bite his heel, but he will crush your head, the offspring of the woman. He will crush your head. And it's the promise of a seed who will defeat evil. And Jesus doesn't just fulfill this, he answers it. Like he is the seed. And then Genesis 3:21, where God made a garment of skin. Adam and Eve covered themselves with fig leaves. God kills an animal, and then covers them with the animal skin. It's the first bloodshed in Scripture to cover shame. And it's foreshadowing substitution, where something else takes the death penalty to cover sacrifice, and ultimately the cross. And so these echoes here, they're going to find resolution in Jesus as the seed who crushes the serpent, in Jesus as the lamb who covers our shame, and then in Jesus who is the second Adam who restarts humanity in a sense and restores what was lost. So the gospel begins in the garden. It doesn't begin in Matthew. It begins right here in the garden. So it doesn't wait till the synoptic gospels or the gospels or when Jesus shows up. The gospel begins here. So there are also foundational core Christian beliefs that are revealed in Genesis 1 through 3. I did a video on this a while ago. You're welcome to go back and look at that. It goes more in depth. But here I'm just going to list them. First, God is fundamentally good, okay? God's action reveals his character. Creation is gorgeous. God creates this whole thing and puts man in it. And then his response to sin is mercy. It's merciful. He covers their shame. He goes looking for them. So God is fundamentally good. That's established in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. We are created for partnership with God, also established in Genesis 1 through 3. Humanity is invited to co-rule, to cultivate, to reflect God's image. Now, the partnership is broken, but it's not abandoned, and God is going to work to restore this. There is inherent value of human life. Every person is created in the image of God. Even after the fall, we might be distorted, it might be muddied, but the dignity remains, and every human life has value because they're made in the image of their Creator. Man and woman as partners. They are created for mutuality, not for hierarchy. They are called to co-create and co-govern. Okay, so man and woman as partners is established here. Marriage is a sacred union between man and woman. This is a covenant of intimacy, of faithfulness, of permanence. It's established before the fall. When Jesus is asked about divorce, he doesn't go back to the law of Moses. He goes back to Genesis 2, where it says, did you not know, have you not read where God has said that a man will leave his father and mother to be with his wife? Like Jesus quotes this portion of scripture for a reason, because it's established before the fall. All humanity is infected by sin. That means the rupture runs deep. Autonomy has replaced trust. We don't want to trust. We want to be in charge of our own lives. All right. And separation becomes the rhythm. So all of humanity is infected by sin. And we all do what is right in our own eyes, even at the expense of others. It's just the way we operate as humanity. And then finally, only God can save us. The promise of the seed, you will bite his heel, but he will crush your head. The covering of the blood, God covers them. The ache of waiting for redemption. God is the only one who can save us. So you see, when you I bring this up to say, when you start with Genesis 3 as the foundation of your biblical story, specifically, okay, it starts at the fall, you miss so many of these fundamental truths that are central to having a right view of Scripture. These themes echo throughout Scripture, and they culminate in the New Jerusalem when Eden is restored. And 5 of these 7 themes listed here happen before the fall, which means they happen in paradise, in God's perfect world, meaning they represent his ideal design, or they represent his character. And starting after the fall muddies the waters of these wonderful truths and why they are important. But many of them happen before the fall. Moving beyond Scripture, if you will, the themes of Genesis season 1 of 1 through 3, they live in other stories. So let's talk about films, okay? They live in films that explore creation, trust, rupture, and mercy. And these stories, they're not meant to just entertain, but they remember Eden, they name the fracture, and they dare to hope for restoration. So let me give you a few of these. These are films that have gospel echoes that can connect to Genesis 1 through 3. And spoiler alert, if you've not seen any of these films, I might mention some stuff. So first we have Arrival, okay? It deals with grief and time and chosen surrender, and then it leads to divine sorrow and covenant promise. So here's what I mean. Those are some of the themes it deals with. Luis's journey is through non-linear time, and it mirrors God's foreknowledge and chosen vulnerability. Luis's surrender to love and loss echoes divine sorrow in Eden, where God knew the rupture, yet he still created. God knew that humanity could turn, that he was giving them a choice, but yet he still creates. And Luis has a different journey than that, but it echoes this idea of love and loss. And the films Linguistic revelation, it parallels covenant as in a new way of understanding um, that binds and transforms. So Arrival deals with some of these echoes. Okay? Louise can see in nonlinear time, so she knows past, present, and future, and knowing that reveals some painful moments in her future. But even knowing those painful moments are coming, she still continues forward with what she's doing, and so it echoes a little bit. It mirrors a little bit of that with God creating humanity. The tree of life. Uh, it has cosmic ache and divine memory, and it's to Eden longed for. So this film is a liturgy of longing. Okay, it weaves creation's beauty with the ache of loss, asking where grace and nature collide, and it whispers. There's the whispered prayers and fractured family. They mirror Eden's rupture, and even the final beach scene gestures towards renewal. It's a memory of Eden not yet forgotten. It's a longing of something that may have been lost, may have been lost, but not forgotten. Okay, one more, Interstellar. Shout out to Christopher Nolan's films, one of my favorite directors. Endurance and New World, and it's Eden reframed. Okay, so Cooper's journey through time and space is a cry for renewal. Earth is dying, and they have to find something new. The film explores human frailty and sacrificial endurance and the longing for a home. In the final act, where love transcends dimensions, it reframes Eden not just as a lost garden, but as a future hope rooted in relational gravity that, hey, this can be restored. There can be more. Again, you have to look for them. You have to pay attention, but there's echoes that can bring us back to the biblical story. These stories echo the arc from Eden to Exile, where fracture is named and mercy dares to remember. In these films, they invite us to see cinematic stories not as distractions, but as conversations that can lead to seeing gospel echoes. And these stories, they whisper to us, the story isn't over, the garden still calls. So these are cinematic expressions of Genesis 1 through 3. All right, so quickly, just want to reflect on God's character, God's posture in all of this. God speaks, God breathes, God walks, and God asks, where are you? God covers and God promises. God is the main character in the story of Scripture. Okay, God is the main character. We are supporting characters. God began the story, and when it goes sideways, he doesn't abandon the story. He promises to rewrite the story. He doesn't erase humanity. He promises to redeem humanity. And he doesn't demand perfection. He promises restoration. God is going to put a plan in motion to restore what has been lost in the fracture. In Genesis 1 through 3, it reveals a God who initiates, a God who pursues, and a God who provides. He is the God who began the gospel in the garden. He is a God of love, grace, compassion, righteousness, and mercy, and he wants his his children, his creation restored to what he had intended it. So this is God's posture in this. All right, so let me just kind of challenge us as we wrap this up. What would change if we read Genesis as story first, not as like an argument for creation versus evolution or pre-fall, post-fall, but like what if we just read it, we're invited into the story, what if we just read it? What if we read Genesis 1 through 3 as story first? I think we would realize it didn't just tell us what happened, it tells us what we've lost and what is restored through Christ. It tells us what's still happening due to sin and what could happen if we let the story lead us to Jesus. It sets the tone for the entire biblical story. When we read Genesis as story first, not doctrine, everything shifts. God is no longer distant or demanding. He's generous, initiating, and near. Work is not punishment, it's partnership. Marriage is no longer hierarchy, it's a sacred union. Human dignity is no longer earned, it's embedded. Sin is no longer just behavior, it's a rupture that is in all of us. And redemption is no longer abstract, it's embodied. We can live redeemed. See, Paul writes in Romans 12:2, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Renew your mind with Scripture. Reading Genesis 1 through 3 is starting there. Reading it as story starts that renewal. It reframes how we treat our spouse, how we treat our work, how we treat our enemies, and how we view God. It reshapes how we see shame and trust, restoration, and sin. I mean, imagine if we lived in a way that, like, yes, this story, we believe it. We would stop hiding and start walking with God again. We would stop grasping for autonomy and start trusting. We would stop blaming and start naming. We'd stop covering ourselves and start receiving grace. And we'd stop performing and start partnering. Marriage would be sacred. Work would be worship. Every person as bearing God's image. We would lead communities that reflect God's generosity, not just God's commands. We would disciple through story, not just sermons. Genesis 1-3 reminds us that we cannot restore what was lost, but that Jesus can and that he already has. Now look, I referenced a few authors in this. I want to give a few more. These scholars that I'm about to mention, they help us interpret Genesis 1-3, not just as doctrine, but as invitation. Not just as origin, but as orientation. And not just as theology, but as sacred story that we are called to live. So I mentioned Craig Bartholomew and Michael Goheen. That's the drama of Scripture. They frame the Bible as a unified narrative of redemption, not a fragmented anthology. There's Robert Alter, The Art of Biblical Narrative. He illuminates the literacy structure of Genesis, emphasizing repetition, rupture, and theological patterning. There's Sandra Riker. I'm going to mess these names up. The Epic of Eden reconnects Genesis to its covenantal arc, clarifying the story-shaped nature of biblical theology. Christopher J.H. Wright in The Mission of God grounds Genesis in missional intent, showing how creation and vocation echo through the church's calling. And then finally, John Goldingay, Old Testament Theology, offers rich theological insights into Genesis as the foundation of divine-human relationship and redemptive pursuit. So check these out if you're interested in this for further study, okay? So let's wrap this up. If this story has stirred something in you, I encourage you, pause, reflect, ask. 3 questions. Where is God inviting me to trust instead of grasp? What would change if I lived as though Eden was remembered and not lost? Where is Christ already rewriting my story and inviting me to carry it forward? And if you are ready to move from watching to engaging, step into the challenge, because the gospel doesn't just reveal what's hidden, it redeems it. Until next time, I'm Kyle. This is Cinematic Scripture. Watch attentively, reflect spiritually, and lead from story, because discipleship lives in what we pay attention to and in the stories we dare to enter. I'll see you next time. Hey friends, thanks for checking out this episode. If it was helpful to you, consider liking it, leave a review or a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and share it with a friend. And if you're a Christian who wrestles with the connection between cinema and theology, who watches film and whispers, I think that story means something, but you don't have the language to name it, know that you're not alone. You don't need another sermon. You don't need a seminary degree. You just need a sacred lens, a simple framework to interpret story with gospel clarity. And that's why I created the 5 Days to Gospel Clarity Through Story Challenge. It's a live, immersive experience where I will help you reframe film as conversation, read scripture narratively, and disciple through story with spiritual depth. Over 5 days, I will guide you through a transformative process to awaken the ache that stories stir and why it matters spiritually, to decode narrative structure and worldview shaping, to see scripture as story, not just doctrine, to engage film with grace, not fear, and to disciple through story with gospel clarity and narrative presence. If you're ready to move from cinematic longing to spiritual activation, then join me at cinematicscripture.com/gospel in story. I'll have the link below. Our next one's coming up. I hope to see you there.